Namaste, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion today on this important topic of fostering disability-friendly higher education institutions. The panelists and organizers believe that language is a powerful way to demonstrate an organization's values and beliefs about disability. As you are aware, there are presently two prevalent ways that we identify with disability in language: person first and identity first. Choosing between these two languages is a personal choice, and we support this right to expression. For the purpose of this panel, we will predominantly use the person-first language. However, each speaker is free to choose and switch between either language or expression. I'm honored to begin by introducing a person who embodies diversity, equity, and inclusion. A native of New York and a career diplomat since 1992, David J. Rands is the Consul General of the United States of America in Mumbai. C.G. Rands previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Pakistan. Prior to that, he was Director of the Office of Pakistan Affairs. His previous assignments include leadership positions at the US embassies in Cairo and Baghdad. C.G. Rands has also served in Rabat, Jerusalem, and Karachi. A warm welcome, Mr. David J. Rands, the Consul General of the US Consulate General in Mumbai. I request you to please open the event with your insights and perspective on the topic of disability inclusion.
Thank you so much, Jiraj, for that lovely introduction. I'm very glad that I'm not wearing the same vest today that I was wearing in that bio photograph, because you might all conclude that I own only one vest, which is absolutely not true. Anyhow, good evening, and thank you all for joining this discussion aimed at fostering a culture of inclusion and accessibility for disabled persons at higher education institutions. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to address what I believe is an important yet overlooked component of human and civil rights today: the rights and needs of persons with disabilities. And what better day than today, World Human Rights Day, to address this issue? In the US, 1 in 4 adults, 64 million Americans, has a disability that impacts major life activities, according to the US Centers for Disease Control. For over 30 years, these individuals have enjoyed the rights afforded them under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, a groundbreaking civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, whether it be jobs, schools, transportation, and places that are open to the general public. The ADA codifies our belief that people with disabilities in the United States should have the same rights and opportunities as their fellow citizens, and protects individuals with disabilities just as our laws protect individuals on the basis of race, color, sex, national origin, age, and religion. The ADA broke down barriers to access and opportunity, enabling millions of Americans to employ their talents and skills and contribute to strengthening their country. As a result, Americans with disabilities have greater access today to the schools, hospitals, jobs, transportation options, stores, and recreational facilities than ever before. We know from the experience of implementing the ADA that responses to issues of access, equity, and inclusion are often driven by the innovation and leadership of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations. We also know that their efforts require the allyship and active support of persons without disabilities as well. In my workplace at the U.S. Department of State, the ADA resulted in a mandate that all of our buildings, including the consulate here in Mumbai, must be fully accessible to those with physical disabilities. But providing physical access alone is insufficient. Given the scale of the challenge, we have taken broader measures. At the State Department, individuals with disabilities make up 12.2% of our full-time permanent workforce. Our Human Resources Division provides reasonable accommodations to these employees, enabling them to perform the essential functions of their jobs through adjustments to the work environment and the provision of assistive technology. To ensure continued innovation and consistent practices, in December 2020, the State Department opened a state-of-the-art Access Center, a facility that provides cutting-edge solutions to department employees with disabilities. This center serves as a showcase for accessibility best practices, not just for the federal government, but also for the diplomatic community and foreign missions in Washington. As such, the department's Access Center has the potential for global impact on individuals with disabilities. The Access Center offers a barrier-free environment for employees with disabilities to test, train, and provide feedback on assistive technology equipment and develop personalized solutions in an environment similar to their workplace. Employees' ability to experiment with equipment prior to installation at their workstation reduces the risk of providing ineffective accommodations that could potentially require revisions or replacements. This measure saves the department time and resources, but more importantly, it saves our employees frustration. We also offer an array of innovative equipment, everything from magnification systems to screen reader software for computer users who are blind or have low vision. Employees who are deaf or hard of hearing can take advantage of a variety of assistive listening devices and deaf to hearing communication systems. Users with dexterity limitations can utilize ergonomic keyboards, mouse, or speech recognition software. Employees are offered an opportunity to test any of these tools at the new Access Center. Lesser known, but perhaps more relevant to this audience, is the creation of the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange. Through this initiative, our Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs aims to increase the participation of people with disabilities in international exchanges between the United States and India, as well as other countries. Here in Mumbai, the U.S. Consulate has worked to include persons with disabilities in our exchange programs. For example, Manjushri Patel, who is a panelist in today's event, used her experiences as an Americans with Disabilities Act Fellow to strengthen the curriculum at Atman Academy in Thane, a school she founded to promote inclusive education for children with learning disabilities. Her advocacy with the Maharashtra state government to apply Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, a concept she studied at the University of Minnesota, resulted in government support to conduct UDL trainings for more than 500,000 students from 36 districts. Under the guidance of the Institute on Community Integrations at the University of Minnesota, Patel continues to lead a certificate course in holistic inclusion of learners with diversities. Atman Academy, it should be noted, has ranked among India's top 10 schools for special needs for 4 consecutive years. Meanwhile, our consulate staff and Education USA advisors regularly provide information about resources and support available on U.S. and university campuses for international students with disabilities. Disabled Indian alumni of U.S. universities such as Stanford have shared the benefits of their college experience at consulate education programs and shared information about support services offered to international students with disabilities at U.S. universities. Our college fair last month included a breakout room, specifically to address questions about campus accessibility for the 1,100 students, parents, and school counselors who participated. With all that being said, today's program is about you, and we welcome and thank the leadership of higher education institutions in addressing this issue through discussions like this one. I hope today's session will inspire you to action in promoting and protecting the human rights of all, and to achieving equal opportunity in education, employment, and participation in civic life for persons with disabilities. Thank you again for your time and attention.
Thank you, Consul General Rance, for these really encouraging words. Let's hope that we can end the discussion today with a better understanding of what our audience today needs for India. So thank you also for setting the tone for our discussion today. Before we really begin, a few ground rules. This meeting today, as you can see, is being recorded, and we will share a link to this recording after the event as a reference and resource for all of you, our registrants. During the webinar, all audience members are really encouraged to ask questions because this, as Consul General Rance said, this is about you. Please use the Q&A feature and feel free to pose your questions, which will be addressed during the question and answer section after the panel discussion. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the challenges faced by millions of students and educational institutions globally, with a paradigm shift in both the method and the mode of teaching. Even before the pandemic, disabled persons have been an invisible, silent, and marginal part of the population in many countries worldwide, and have been excluded from a host of experiences that non-disabled persons enjoy. The World Health Organization, in a 2011 report, stated that an individual's environment also plays an important factor in experiencing disability and in determining to what extent it will affect the individual's enjoyment of human rights, inaccessible environments create disability by creating barriers to participation and inclusion. As we consider the best environment for education institutions to foster a disability-friendly environment, let's first briefly understand the present circumstances and legislations prevalent in India and the US. The Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016, which was enacted by the Parliament of India with a specific chapter for education, enumerating rights of disabled students to foster an inclusive environment in educational institutions. The Act provides for specific measures by state governments and local authorities to promote and facilitate inclusive education. Similar legislation in the US, as mentioned by Consul General Rands, makes available free public education to eligible children and youth with disabilities throughout the United States and ensures accessibility, special education, and related services are available. While these legislations emphasize the need of inclusive education for children and youth with disabilities and empower education institutions through various measures and resources to ensure proper identification, monitoring, and implementation of these measures, many practical challenges still exist, not only with infrastructure and capacity, but also with the understanding the needs of disabled students and providing alternatives. Our discussion today will focus mainly on identifying these gaps and challenges and enumerating some resources and best practices adopted both in the US and in India. So let's meet our panelists for today, who are active inclusivity practitioners in the field of higher education in their respective countries. Our first panelist for this evening is Dr. Amanda Krause, who is the president of the Association on Higher Education and Disability, or AHED. She is also the Assistant Vice President of Campus Life and the Executive Director at the Disability Resource Center at the University of Arizona. Dr. Krause has spent her career in student affairs and disability resources at the university, whose Disability Resource Center is now considered an international model of progressive service delivery, uniquely positioned to approach campus access proactively and systemically. Across her research, teaching, and practice, she draws upon disability studies, universal design, and social justice principles to challenge the dominant deficit or tragedy narrative on disability to increase equity in higher education and ultimately reframe concepts of difference. She is also president for AHED and has had the privilege of delivering keynote addresses and facilitating workshops at institutions both in the US and abroad. Outside of work, Dr. Krause is an avid wheelchair tennis player and has worked with the United States Tennis Association to grow opportunities for disabled players and increase the national visibility of the sport. Welcome, Amanda. Our second panelist for this evening is Ms. Emily Shyrock, who is the Assistant Director of Services for Students with Disabilities at the University of Texas at Austin. Ms. Shyrock collaborates with students, faculty, and staff to make the university more accessible and inclusive, and enjoys advocating and educating people on topics connecting to disability and accessibility. She is a regular presenter at the AHED National Conference and has also presented at the Pacific Rim International Conference on Disability and Diversity. She serves her community as the vice chair of the Austin Mayor's Committee for People with Disabilities and is on the board of directors for nonprofits Parking Mobility, Arts Park Texas, and Acro Yoga Austin. She is an athlete and enjoys staying active and competing in wheelchair rugby, tennis, hand cycling, triathlons, and practicing acro yoga. Ms. Shyrock and her service dog Maple enjoy exploring new places and meeting new people together. Welcome, Emily. Our third panelist for this evening is Ms. Manjushri Patil. Ms. Patil founded Atman Academy, a specialized instruction inclusive, recognized school for children with diverse learning needs. With over 3 decades of experience in the field, she has been an advisor, consultant, and chief trainer for a year-long program on inclusive education with the government of Maharashtra. This program has impacted more than 500,000 teachers from 36 districts of the state. She is the director and key content creator of the Certificate in Holistic Inclusion of Learners with Diversities. This is a course on inclusive education, which runs in association with the University of Minnesota and is funded by the Tata Trusts. She is also the recipient of a prestigious exchange program run by the US government, that the CG mentioned in his opening remarks. Welcome, Emily. I'm sorry, welcome, Manjushri. I will be your host for today. My name is Dheeraj Mehra. I'm the Director for Initiatives in India with the University of Notre Dame, situated in South Bend, Indiana. I will be moderating our discussion, and I'm honored to be given an opportunity to help chart over the next 75 minutes with these three amazing panelists and all of you. We have also made a provision for an Indian Sign Language interpreter, Ms. Shreya Soni, who will be translating for us today. You may view both the active speaker and the interpreter by changing your Zoom settings. Let's start with our discussion and our first question for the day. I'd like to invite Amanda to answer this first question. Amanda, what does a disability-friendly campus look like? And what are the key requirements that are really required to create and maintain such a campus?
Thank you, Dheeraj, for the question and for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. It is early morning in Arizona. A disability-friendly campus, in my opinion, goes beyond mere accessibility and really looks at how to make all aspects of a college or university campus welcoming and inviting. So really looking at how to be inclusive rather than just tolerant or accessible. Ideally, disabled students would have the same opportunities, whether they're academic or co-curricular, of course, looking beyond the classroom at social and community connections is critically important to the success of university students. So we want to make sure that all of our experiences have a level vision that really signals to disabled students that they're welcome. I think
Amanda, I think you have an issue with the connectivity. There, we have you back. Please go on. Amanda, may I ask you to unmute, please?
Of course. All right. I apologize for the internet issues. I'm not exactly sure where I was cut off, but what I was trying to articulate was a vision for disability-friendly campuses as something beyond basic access and basic legal compliance, but where colleges and universities were committed to truly inclusive experiences, both in the classroom and outside the classroom for disabled students and all students. Disabled students, once they are admitted to a college or university, are college or university students who are entitled to the full range of curricular and co-curricular experiences that non-disabled students are. So a goal is really to look at how to promote a similar, if not identical, experience for disabled students with respect to basic access. I don't know that 30 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act, that basic access is enough really to signal that disability is valued and welcomed on a university campus. I think we must start to look at real inclusion and equity for disabled people, and really over communicate the value of disability. And I would suggest doing that formally and informally, actively and passively, in our literature, in our websites, in our marketing, to name disability, to show disability as part of the community, to welcome individuals to request accommodations, to signal to them that we have thought about access in a number of ways. in addition to, the work of the disability services folks, the people who are really looking at access and inclusion, all members of a college or university community should be considering disability a priority as we look at our other interests toward diversifying our campuses, toward creating inclusion. When we look at the success and retention of students, we must also all be committed to the disability experience. And I think in terms of what a disability-friendly campus looks like, it's a number of things. And really shifting, I think, our concept of disability away from something that happens separately and can only be responded to via legal compliance or services, but to something that is truly woven into every aspect, to the real fabric of our campus communities.
Thank you, Amanda. I think that was a very interesting and a very different definition for disabled-friendly campuses than that I've really looked at. I also remember reading your article in which you mentioned that when colleges put out marketing materials, that they should mention disabilities as part of their diversity and not just ethnicity and region. So I think you did link back to that a little bit, and we will share that article with our audience in the post event. Manjushri, maybe if I can call on you to help answer a question which is more relevant to our audience in India. Is it possible to adapt current infrastructure of our colleges and campuses here to be more accessible?
Thank you, Dheeraj. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me here. I will definitely say that it all begins with will, Dheeraj. When Amanda has said it so beautifully and in such a spirited fashion that if you will something to happen, and in fact, that's the motto of my school, I've willed it, I'll build it. That's what it says. And build does not really physically mean physical building. It obviously means something that I want to do and I will aspire to do it and I'll persevere to do it. So making campuses become more accessible is very possible, very doable if there's a buy-in from everybody, right from the management up to the person who's at various positions in the college. Having said that, I have been constantly reading up and we talk about accessibility all the time. For me, what really matters is not just physical accessibility, but even human accessibility. Are people in campuses accessible? Are they ready to have a dialogue with persons with disabilities? And is that dialogue sensitive? So I will give you personal stories of students who have come back to me. So I've had 9 batches of standard 10 students who have passed out, and this is the 10th one next year. I've had students who've come back to me and said, ma'am, they keep calling us handicapped. They keep saying this line is not for you, you go there. So we feel a little upset because, so we have learning disabilities, but we don't need to be reminded that. So that is where I feel that concept of accessibility, physical accessibility, once it's decided, it can be done. It, of course, just requires funds. And so it's it's an entire organizational decision. But human accessibility, being accessible to a person, is a very individual thing that every person, right from the professors, the lecturers, to the office staff, who is taking in forms, giving out information about examinations and all of that, even they need to be accessible, and that I think really begins from a will to do it. And this is where I'm reminded, and since our audience is a lot Indian, I'm reminded of Munna Bhai MBBS and the movie where he really gives a real he makes a case for the fact that we can be humane. That's all it really boils down to start up with, and then there are lots of other layers to it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Manjushri. I totally agree with you. I think if there's a will, there's a way, and you just need to find the right way. And I loved your discussion about not just infrastructure, but also people need to make that change and be more accessible for disabled students. Emily, maybe I could ask my next question to you. How do you really create and maintain a student office on disabilities? And should there really be a separate office, when we look at physical disabilities compared to learning disabilities that Manjushri just mentioned in the last question?
Thank you for that question, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. So when you're thinking about starting from the beginning or creating a disability services office, you have the opportunity to think where you're going to center that organization within your campus structure. And that's really important because that can send a message for how disability is viewed on your campus. So for example, in the United States, you'll find disability services office located at different places kind of within the organizational structure. So disability services may be located within the medical services or health center, sending a message that disability is a condition that needs to be treated. Sometimes disability services offices are located within learning support centers, so maybe with the tutoring center, sending that message that disability is a learning problem that needs to be addressed through that lens. At the University of Texas at Austin, our office is located within the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement. So at a very high level, we are sending the message that disability is prioritized and seen as part of our campus diversity. And so that's an important thing to think about. What message are you sending simply by the location of your disability services office? We also recognize that it's not enough just to set that stage and say, okay, we've checked that off the list. Now disability is part of our diversity. It also requires a lot of work on the ground to make sure that that reality is lived out and fully experienced by disabled people on campus. Another key factor in creating and maintaining a disability services office is involve people with disabilities in leadership and staff positions. When you have the opportunity to incorporate people who are directly impacted by accessibility barriers, that's going to be a really key part of making a successful disability services office, bringing that lived experience along with professional skills and qualifications. It's also really important to have that administrative support. As both Amanda and Manjushri have mentioned, disability and accessibility is a campus-wide responsibility, and it takes that effort. And so you really need to make sure that you have that support from the higher ups. When there is something that requires maybe changing a long-standing tradition of how things have been done, when there is a project that may require some expense, you need to make sure that the leadership and administration understands the importance of it and can back up and support those initiatives and make sure that those can continue to move forward. As far as your question about whether disability offices should be separate or divided kind of by type of disability, it is very true that disability is a very broad and diverse category, but I believe that we're all part of the disabled community and that there is strength in sharing those perspectives and experiences with each other. So having one disability services office really allows that expertise, allows that community building to happen on a campus. Staff, of course, then have to be knowledgeable about a wide range of disabilities, a wide range of access barriers, but that can be accomplished with that intentionality. And one thing that we see in the United States is students who have more than one disability. So then if you have two separate offices, do you send somebody to the office for learning disabilities or physical disabilities? So understanding the complexity of disability, and maybe you have specialized departments within your office. That's how our office is structured. We have a department for our assistive technology and a department for testing. And so students who need those accommodations can use the services from those departments, but it's not separated by disability category. It's separated and specialized by the accommodations that the students may need.
Thanks, Emily. I think I agree with you when you say that the messaging is important. And I did read about what you mentioned about the university having its disability office outside of any outside of any messaging that says that there's something wrong with you. I think that's very, very important when we look at disabilities. Amanda, maybe could you help share some best practices as well as challenges faced by you in fostering a disabled-friendly higher education institution? And if you can even suggest some steps that are easily implementable for our audience here in India.
Right, of course. And I think Manjushri has already mentioned universal design, and I understand that that's key to her work, and I'm sure for Emily as well. But universal design is a set of strategies that really looks at how to reduce the need for any sort of accommodation or modification that seeks to provide everyone with the same equitable, good, convenient experience. Universal design was born out of architecture, so it has its roots in the built environment. However, there have been many applications of universal design that we can look at in the curricular environment. So we can look at universal design for learning and teaching and instruction. I think looking to universal design offers a lot of promising practice in ways that we can be really designing environments that are welcoming and usable for everyone. Like I mentioned earlier, it's not welcoming, right? It's not inclusive when individuals need to seek out accommodations to get the same level of access that their non-disabled counterparts simply get by virtue of showing up. And we can look at universal design as a way to really meet our legal requirements, but also our philosophical priorities around community. So I'm not going to go on with universal design because I'm sure it will come up throughout the conversation. But I would like to just mention quickly a few other best practices. Partnerships, partnerships, partnerships. As everyone has said so far, disabled students are members of the campus community. So really working together with faculty and administrators, policymakers, trying to really inform the design of a campus that is inclusive, right? That does not need retrofitting or modifications. We can think about access systemically by looking at our decision-making, our purchasing processes, our planning, and really start to shift the campus culture by looking at how to create the most systemically inclusive experiences. I would also point to disability studies as a way to influence our curriculum. There are many, many ways that we can look at other cultural studies, really appreciating research and scholarship that looks critically at a variety of histories and experiences. And so too does disability studies. So looking at teaching disability, teaching disabled researchers and authors, teaching a critical perspective on the disability experience. Relatedly, supporting disability culture. In the US, there are a few institutions that have dedicated spaces and dedicated resources to educate and explore the disability experience in what we call cultural centers. However, there are lots of institutions that are promoting that type of programming and events, even outside of a proper center. And as long as higher education continues to respond to disability only through services and only through accommodations, that gives disabled and non-disabled people the impression that that's all disability is. And as a disabled person, I can tell you access is one small piece of a much larger lived experience. So higher education should really educate and celebrate about the entirety of the experience. I can certainly talk about challenges, and I might just do a quick mention before Manjushri jumps in. But challenges still exist, certainly in the United States, 30 years past our legal mandates, it is still very challenging at times to help administrators, faculty, other staff to understand why we have to go beyond the bare minimum legal mandate. And, when we're really trying to think about disability in the context of our larger institutional priorities, again, retention, belonging, success, it's critical to look at how students feel a member of the campus. And oftentimes your accommodation does not make you feel welcome. So it is important to think bigger about our legal obligations and not so narrowly interpret them. So we can meet our legal obligations by promoting universal design, by promoting a more expansive understanding of access. And so I would say that continues to be a challenge in how we represent the work and how we represent institutional responsibility when it comes to accessibility.
Thank you for those words, Amanda. Manjushri, maybe if you could answer the same question, with the perspective that you have seen here in India as well for our audience. Can I ask you to unmute, please?
So I think Amanda has beautifully covered all of the points in terms of what are the things that can be done. One of the things that we seem to overlook in our universities is two concepts which are key to UDL, and that's something close to Amanda's heart, and I think it's close to my heart as well. One is barrier-free learning. So while we are talking about barrier-free environments, barrier-free spaces, barrier-free anything, learning experiences, I want to step one step behind and say, do we even look at the fact that there are barriers in children's or students' learning? We don't even realize it many, many times that this could be possibly a barrier to a child's learning. A very simple thing is like including Shreya in today's session. Whether or not there may be people who may be hearing impaired today, this is UDL. Having her here is like having an option available. So that's the second part, giving choices and having options available. These are two key factors of UDL that we, if we bring into our schools, our colleges, our HEIs, in higher education institutions, I think we then will be on a smooth run towards inclusion. We won't need to think more. Once we've decided, we know that it is for them. The other thing that I want to bring other than UDL is the thought that, as special educators, we keep saying, nothing about me without me. So if there are decisions being taken, if there are policies, there are legal practices, it's very prudent to actually bring persons with disabilities into the picture and obviously get their take on this matter, which is something possibly we tend to overlook. I'm not making a blanket statement. Please don't get me wrong. We're all learning. We're all in the process. But it is something that we need to start getting into doing. And it will happen over a period of time. I think with the NEP in place, a lot more thought, a lot more deliberation on this matter has begun. So that is also another thing that we need to do. And the last thing that I want to say here is that when we take persons with disabilities into the picture, we also need to therefore take a multidisciplinary perspective of how to make our spaces and our places and our programs and our curriculum more disabled friendly. So which then means bringing in voices from all perspectives, from all the disabilities. For example, in India, we've spelled out 21 disabilities. So at least those that are definitely connected to HEIs, bringing their perspectives and their voices on the table and having them also give their experiences and expertise.
Thanks, Manjushri. I think my takeaway from this question is the best practice is to try and make sure that it comes naturally and it isn't an effort to be inclusive. Just thinking, going further with this question, Emily, What kind of commitment do you think is required to make such work successful? From the students' point of view, faculty, administrators, the community in general, and how do you really sensitize the institution to the needs of disabled people?
Well, I'm going to echo a lot of what Amanda shared in her last question about partnerships, and that access and inclusion has to be a campus-wide priority, and everyone has to feel like they are a part of that and recognize what that means for their role on campus. Sometimes we hear professors or staff who call our office for a consultation and they say, we have one of your students here. And I always push back on that and say, how can we help our students? Because as admitted students, as enrolled students, they are part of our entire campus. They are not our students in disability services. And so that is an important perspective shift. It's also really important for everyone on campus to realize that disability services is not the only people who have to do with accessibility. And so we do trainings across campus to help people think about what does access and inclusion look like within their work. So for example, we will do trainings for the museums that we have on campus. What does accessibility and inclusion look like for their visitors? We will do trainings for our admissions office. What does access and inclusion look like for those who are coming for a campus tour? And so those are the examples of how we try to make sure that there is a commitment and everybody understands what their role looks like as far as accessibility.
Emily, if I can ask you to maybe just pause for a moment while Shreya reconnects. I think we lost our ISL.
Absolutely.
I guess in the interest of time, she will join in. I'm going to try and connect with her to check what's happened. Maybe you can continue there. Did she come in? Not yet. Maybe just continue, and I'm going to try and reach out to see if she's had any issue with her device.
Thank you. So another thing that Manjushri mentioned that I also believe is very important in building that commitment to accessibility and inclusion is listening and a commitment to learning. Learning from the people who are directly affected by barriers on campus. And to that end, our office has created both a student advisory committee and a faculty advisory committee made up of members of our community. So we can hear from them what is going well, what needs improvement. When we have new ideas for policies or projects or events, we can get that student and faculty feedback. And that has really been a critical component of the partnerships that we have on campus, and feeling confident that we are addressing the areas that are most pressing and most concerning to students and faculty. So that is something that we have found to be a very helpful resource and tool. And then another opportunity that we have to listen and learn is administering annual surveys for both students, disabled students, and our faculty. So again, providing those opportunities to listen and learn, and then to share that feedback out. So that these different offices are hearing the stories and hearing the barriers. It's not just our office coming and saying you need to add captioning to videos. That's important for access, but it's understanding here are the students who were impacted negatively because you didn't do that, and really wanting to help people understand that this is not just theory, that this is having an impact when it's not done correctly on students' ability to be able to fully engage and participate. But it needs to be campus-wide conversations, and it does need to be campus-wide priorities. People often just don't know what that means. They might say, yeah, we'd be happy to be accessible or inclusion. We'd be happy to incorporate universal design, but what does that actually mean for our office? So being able to provide that training and those resources is a really key component of being able to empower people to do that work for themselves.
Thank you, Emily. I think one challenge that most institutions globally face with regard to accessibility is the issue of limited resources. Manjushri, maybe if I can ask you to maybe just address this, how do institutions that have limited resources really address this issue about accessibility?
I think answering that question is not very difficult because limited resources, if we are talking about monetary resources, I don't know whether I can comment on that because that's about every college, every institution's internal matter. But otherwise, if we are talking about infrastructure, and again, we are talking about physical infrastructure and the emotional or psychological infrastructure, probably I'm again rooting my answer in the same direction because I really believe if there's a will to get inclusion happening in the school or college, I'm sorry I keep using school because my experience has been a lot about school as well. So it's absolutely possible and doable if the entire organization has decided that inclusion is a non-negotiable principle of their organization, of their college, then you will leave no stone unturned. Then everything just falls in place. There is no question about it. If I've decided that I am inclusive and I will continue to be this way, not because I'm doing anybody a favor, because it is the right thing to do, the rightmost thing to do, then everything that everybody does as a team will be inclusive. Which brings me to just one more point here, Dheeraj, that, we keep talking about inclusive spaces, people and teams. But a couple of years ago, I was the principal of an international school and I was trying to push in, inclusion. And I realized inclusion is, and I'm talking about many years ago, almost 12, 13, 14 years ago. I realized that it is principal to peon. Everybody has to be in a space of inclusion. Only then can inclusion be successful across the entire program in the college. It doesn't help with just 4 or 5 people being very gung-ho about inclusive education and about inclusion, and the rest of the people thinking, oh, it's just a fad. It's not possible. It's just not possible, because if you stay in that mind frame that no persons with disabilities cannot and are not able to, then that's exactly the way you're going to look at every person with a diverse learning need. So that's why I said it's kind of easy to answer that question because it's tied in with what I said earlier. As regards whether infrastructurally things can change, I said, and I repeated that it's something that every organization needs to decide as a policy. I hope I've answered the question.
No, thank you, Manjushri. I think you have made a good attempt at that. Emily, there's a very important conversation that comes about when students apply for colleges. Do you think it should be required for students to disclose their disabilities when applying to colleges or when applying for financial aid? What's your opinion, on this very interesting question that came up, with something I was thinking about?
I believe you'll need to turn on my video for me.
I'm sorry, let me do that.
All right. Well, thank you for that question. This was one that, you may get different answers from different folks. But when it comes to requiring disclosure of disability, that is something that I believe we need to be very cautious about. People with disabilities, disabled people, should always be in control of if, how, and when they disclose their disability. So is that something that really needs to be required, or is that something that can be optional? What are the reasons that you are asking for disclosure? And being very clear about that for students so that they are able to make that decision for themselves, whether or not they want to disclose. In the United States, based on the laws that we have for protecting people with disabilities, you cannot make decisions based on the disclosure of a disability. So if a student were to disclose a disability during an admission process, disability cannot be a deciding factor for whether or not that student would be accepted into that university or into that program. So asking for disability disclosure may happen after that student has already been accepted. And usually when we're asking about disclosure, it is tied to the need for accommodations. So asking, if you need accommodations because of a disability, check this box and we'll reach out to you. Or here is the information that you would need to contact the Disability Services Office, and allowing them to opt into that and deciding when they choose to do that. In cases such as financial aid, there may be times when students might be eligible for a specific scholarship or a specific type of aid, and that might be a reason they would want to disclose. But again, making that optional, allowing them to make that decision for themselves, and also being very intentional about sharing why that might be important to disclose. So, maybe in that checkbox or where you're asking that, explaining that we have funding specifically for disabled students. If you believe you're eligible for this or would like more information, here's who you contact, or here's how you share your information, rather than requiring students to disclose. Manjushri said the famous line of the disability rights movement, "Nothing about us without us," and really trying not to take an authoritarian approach where we are requiring people to disclose information that they may not be wanting to disclose, they may not be ready to disclose, or they simply may not understand what are you going to do with this information. And so really being intentional if somebody is asking about disability status, thinking through, why are we asking this information? What are we doing with it? Who has access to it? And how is this being communicated to students? And in most cases, you're likely going to find that it doesn't need to be a requirement. It can simply be a way of sharing information, sharing why a student might want to disclose, sharing what the different opportunities or supports that might be available for them if they are someone who has a disability, and then giving them that choice of how they want to proceed.
Thanks, Emily, for that very interesting perspective. The other end of college life is when students start thinking about applying for a job. Amanda, can you maybe share how career support services work with companies to recruit students from the disabled communities? And this is also a question that came in from one of our audience members in a little different wording, but I think your answer should help satisfy the question from our audience member as well.
Yeah, of course. Am I unmuted? Can you hear and see me?
Loud and clear. We can hear you, Amanda. Go on.
Okay, I hope that, okay, great. I apologize for the connection issues that I'm experiencing. Can work with diversity and inclusion.
You can try now. I think you should be good to go.
I'm sorry. Am I getting? And I was like, can you hear me? Okay, I'm just going to try to. The primary role I think that a career services or career support unit can offer to employers is to help them in demonstrating their commitment to diversity. Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Oh, I so apologize every time I try to talk. Anyway, I would say, trying to say that career services offices can help employers demonstrate their commitment to diversity and inclusion, including their commitment to working with disabled students and disabled employees. Dheeraj mentioned this before, but something as simple as including images that represent the diversity that they're trying to recruit, that represent disabled people, in a variety of contexts, signals to disabled people that they might be successful at that organization. Including disability language when an organization is talking about their commitment to diversity. Indicating that employees are welcome to request accommodations to make the workplace accessible. I think there's a lot of passive, kind of that, just the communication, whether in images or in language, that would demonstrate a commitment to accessibility. As the university liaises with an employer, I think it's important for the university to suggest or strongly suggest that any information that the employers are trying to share with prospective employees, with graduating students, are accessible. Providing either large print copies, having those available, directing people to websites that are accessible, ensuring that any marketing, any videos are captioned, are audio described, just really looking at anything they're trying to put in front of a prospective employee, ensuring that it is accessible. If and when a university invite an employer to campus to engage with students, ensuring that their space that is accessible, a wheelchair user, for a blind student, really to get the most diverse group of people. I think non-apparent disabilities probably have the most to think about in terms of if and when to disclose their disability to their employer. And this is, building off of Emily's comments just earlier. So, it's very, there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of pressure, and it can be very sensitive to think about how and when do I disclose my disability in the workplace. You might never disclose your disability. You might never have to. But I think what is most important about the employer is really indicating that we welcome diversity, we include disability in diversity, and you are welcome to request accommodations. I think that can do a lot to assuage any sort of, anxiety that people might have about how and when to disclose disability in the workplace. So I apologize for my internet, and I hope that this came through.
Now, technical difficulties are part of, I think, virtual panels. So we did get the information through pretty well. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Manjushri, maybe I could ask you this next question. What are the various accommodations that can be offered to students in a class or during exams? If you can maybe help enumerate that for some of our audience members.
There are a wide array of accommodations that can be made available. So it is disability specific, but there is a lot of, for one thing, there is a lot of assistive technology that can be made available for learners who are hearing impaired or who are blind and visually impaired. Students who are on the spectrum also do very well with assistive technology that helps them in communication. So that works beautifully. When it comes to classroom transactions, now, of course, there is an online classroom transaction and there is an offline classroom transaction. Both have their share of challenges when it comes to the teacher transacting. But within the classroom, I think the sensitivity to understand, the teacher to be able to understand that this is the nature of the person's disability. Her little background understanding in terms of her reading about that disability, so that she knows what are the do's and don'ts that she needs to be more mindful about when that student or the learner is in class. I'll give you a very simple example. There are a lot of hearing impaired learners who prefer lip reading. And so when the teacher turns her back to the classroom and starts writing, it becomes a big hindrance for that person, because it's like the drop in connectivity. You keep losing out on what that professor was actually saying. So this is just an example. With regards to classroom transactions, I also believe that we need to be more mindful about pace learning versus race learning, being aware that a certain learner may not be able to take down notes. And these are again coming from first-hand experiences that my own students have shared with me. So, they say, ma'am, professors kind of ramble at times, and we are lost in the classroom because we can't take down notes like our other peers. So being aware of that, or giving them the opportunity to take photographs or do an audio recording, which is something that one of my students said. She said, my college allowed me to audio record every professor's class, and I used to go back home and then take down notes at my own pace, which made it so much easier for me, because then there was no stress for me to kind of put everything onto my book and my paper right away, right there. So these are just some of the thoughts that are coming to my mind, top of my mind right now. And there are like a whole host of them, a plethora of things that can be done. Online also has its own share of challenges. Again, the awareness that there are learners who have different requirements, and sometimes I have noticed that we do tend to switch off cameras and take classes. That may not necessarily be the best option for learners who have challenges, and they are more visual, and so that's why we keep saying, within the UDL paradigm, we've always been saying, and as a trainer through my Government of Maharashtra experience, I have understood, we keep saying that let's look at students as learners, visual, auditory, or kinesthetic tactile learners. And once we know that they are learners, then their disability takes a second seat. The first seat is, what kind of a learner are you, and how can I cater to your specific learning style? That's all it matters. And when we're talking about assessments, there is another set of things that can be done. So I'll quickly wrap up with assessments. There are a lot of facilities being given by different governments. Maharashtra government, for one, the state in which we are, there are a lot of provisions and a lot of concessions that are being made available, and I'll enumerate a few of them. One is that students get extra time for if they have any disabilities that are marked disabilities which have come through certification from government agencies, then they get extra time. Students with different categories of disabilities, for example, children with learning disabilities who have dyslexia, or students who are on the autism spectrum, or students who are visually impaired / blind, they get readers and writers. Then students who have a physical challenge are those who get centers that are closer to their home. Then calculators are also allowed for certain types of disabilities within the GR that comes. So it's a government rule, it's called. And the other thing that they do get is also a drop in subject. But that is, of course, at the HEI, at the higher education level, it's already there that students are allowed to take options in their subjects. So I think that is not such a big challenge at that point of time, but that is an option that needs to be given to students. So I talked about classroom transactions, and I talked about assessments, and these are some of the arrangements that are available to learners with disabilities.
Thanks, Manjushri. I think that was a pretty comprehensive answer. So I'm going to move on to the next question. And I'll start with maybe Emily on this one. Is there a way to be more inclusive with disabled students while teaching them online? We saw what happened with the pandemic, and this did come mainstream even for every educational institution. And how do we teach online? Could you maybe throw some light on how we could be more inclusive while teaching online as well?
Absolutely. The pandemic was a learning opportunity for all of us in a variety of ways. And it was interesting to see how the online learning environment for some students was much more accessible. There were certainly a lot of students who struggled for a lot of reasons, but we did see that the flexibility that was offered through the online learning platform really was a great example of the universal design for learning practices that we've been talking about throughout this webinar. So all of a sudden, students have options of obtaining information. So in many cases, you could show up to the lecture and interaction live. In most cases, they were recorded and that information was shared after class. And so there was multiple opportunities to gain access to information in a way that we often didn't have if you just showed up and there was a live class and then it was over. And if you couldn't take notes or you missed information, you would have had lost access to that learning opportunity. Now there was more flexibility. With participation, students had the opportunity to maybe respond to questions in the chat rather than verbally articulate their responses, or vice versa. Instead of writing responses, they would be able to verbally share those. And so UDL is all about options and allowing students to engage and participate in the way that is going to work best for them. And so we saw a lot of those opportunities provided during the online learning opportunity that we had. There were some challenges, definitely don't want to gloss over those. When accessibility tools are not being used, that is when more challenges came up. So not enabling the captions on Zoom, or not adding captions to videos, not recording lectures, all those things then became barriers. But what's happening now is we return to campus and students have had a taste of what it's like to have these options. They're still wanting that to continue. They're wanting to have that same level of access and opportunity that they had in an online learning space. And so we're now being challenged to think about what does that look like, rather than just going back to how we were teaching pre-pandemic, which was often very structured, very rigid, didn't have a lot of that flexibility. And therefore students needed those individualized accommodations through the Disability Services Office. They want more of that experience of it's just already available to them right from the beginning. Another interesting aspect of the online learning that we heard from students is those who had visible disabilities. And usually when they come into a class, their disability is noticeable to the professor and to students. And they're often, on the receiving end of maybe questions, maybe people who don't know how to interact with somebody with a disability, and all of a sudden their disability may not be apparent on screen when you're only being seen from the shoulders up. And so some students did like that opportunity of kind of having that anonymity, and rather than, continuing that in an in-person environment, it's really more about how do we educate our campus community and our campus partners so that students aren't feeling that sense of other, that sense of stigma that they may encounter when interacting with people with disabilities who may not know kind of the best way to welcome and support and ensure access in an in-person environment. So we've learned a lot. I'm hoping that we can maintain some of the positive aspects of an online learning environment while also continuing to improve the in-person experience as we gain the benefits of that as well.
Thank you, Emily. I think I agree with you in many ways. Moving online gave opportunities to change the way, as we talked earlier, about the mode and the method of teaching. And some of them may have really been more helpful in being more inclusive in our teaching methods. I have one question that's really been, at the back of my mind since we started discussing this particular topic. And Amanda, I hope your connection is good enough, but I want you to seriously think and answer this question for me. Can you describe this difference of equality versus equity in terms of making campuses disabled friendly?
Yes, I hope so. Okay, I hope so. I think, Dheeraj, that is the question for us to be considering as we think about working to make our campuses disability friendly and inclusive. I think about access as existing on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum is compliance, right, with our federal legislation. This is what we need to do to create something that is, is accessible and meets the letter of the law. The other end of the spectrum is equitable access, is equity. So there is a real difference between accessible and equitable. Equitable is the same, right? Equitable is shared. And that is ultimately what I believe all of our laws, right? American or international laws to promote disability access. I think that is really what these laws were trying to achieve. So if we're looking at the spirit of these laws to promote inclusion, we can do that by promoting an equitable experience. And like I mentioned earlier, accommodations will get you access, but they're not always very good, right? And again, as a disabled person and a disabled professional, I can attest to that, a lifetime of accommodations, in fact, that do provide access, but can also be quite separate, quite different, more burdensome, more arduous, again, in trying to get the same access that non-disabled people just get. And it's that burden that I think really contributes to the feeling of marginalization, especially in the competitive and exclusive environment that is higher education. So as we think about equality versus equity, I am all to disabled institutions by the same competitive standards. So we want to ensure for disabled community members that they have an identical classroom outside of the classroom that's feeling like they matter, feeling like they belong. And 30 years post ADA, right, I would love to start more of an expansive understanding of what the law has been trying to promote and trying to cultivate. So again, your question, Dheeraj, really one that I hope we all consider as we think about our roles at our institutions. We think about our commitment to diversity and inclusion. Equity is going to be the best way, right, to demonstrate that commitment and to engage students in a way that's meaningful and effective. It will also meet the letter of the law, but it will be a better demonstration of the spirit of the law.
Thank you, Amanda. I truly believe in the spirit of everything, and I think that was a perfect ending to our regular list of questions. I'm going to turn to our audience questions, and I'm taking the liberty of maybe just picking any one of you for answering them. Just how I feel, I think who would be best able to answer them. The first question, I think maybe Emily, if you could help answer from one of our audience members is the term differently abled more appropriate than disabled?
Well, we could have had a whole webinar just discussing that question. And as you mentioned at the beginning, when it comes to language related to disability, there are lots of different thoughts and perspectives. From the perspective that I come from, there's nothing wrong with the word disability or disabled. And so rather than finding euphemisms to talk around disability, let's just say the word loud and proud. I have a disability, I am disabled. There's nothing wrong with using those terms. In the United States, we do see special needs used more in K through 12, so more of the primary school environment. But in higher education, we don't see that term used. We use disability, disabled, and really reclaiming that as an aspect of our identity, as we've talked, a part of our campus diversity. And so there's no need to talk around it. We often do have people who say that the name of our office should not have the word disability in it, because not everyone identifies with the word disability. And we certainly want to respect where people are with their own self-identification. But that doesn't mean that we need to remove or eliminate it. So from my perspective, the perspective of the role that I work in, we would not use those euphemisms such as special needs or differently abled. We just simply use the word disability without any shame or stigma attached to that, in a way that proudly represents our identity and our culture. And there could be many more perspectives shared on this. I know for a lot of people, the word disabled has been seen as something that's negative. And so leaning more towards the person first language in an attempt to kind of separate that from, you are not just disabled, you are a person with a lot of different identities. And so there is a spectrum of how people choose to identify. But from my perspective, nothing wrong with the word disability, and hopefully that we can have more conversations and that becomes more accepted across broader society, that disability is just a different life experience. It can still be a rich and valuable and fulfilling life experience. It's not something that we have to try to avoid or erase.
Yeah, I agree with Emily. It related back to the opening statement on language that we made, but I think it was still necessary for us to address it in this. It is a question that comes up very often when we talk about disabilities. Maybe I can ask Amanda to answer this next question. And this is related to resources and size of institution, but looking at low enrollment of persons with disabilities in higher education in India, how can these institutions build an environment where we have such students coming to enroll? And this is a related question that's coming from another audience member, that most of the time small institutions get very less students of disability every year. Maybe sometimes there are none. In such cases, how do you prioritize the needs of the needs of the disability parameters?
Yeah, that's certainly a challenge that we struggle with in the US as well. I think going back to some of what Emily was talking about earlier, we don't really know who identifies as disabled, because in the States, we're prohibited from requiring disclosure of disability, which has pros and cons associated with it. One of the cons or the challenges is that we don't have a good sense of our numbers when everything is based on self-report. So I think it goes back to outreach. Like we've mentioned throughout this conversation, higher education is exclusive and it has an exclusive history. And we still need to do a lot of work to come out from that and really over communicate our interest in working with diverse students who have been intentionally excluded, right, from higher education opportunities, including students with disabilities. I think outreach is critical, and I know that every institution has a different plan for that. But working with K through 12, working with your high schools, your secondary schools, in ensuring that disabled students would be welcome to apply, that they could receive accommodations, that they may seek accommodations in the application process. I think those are all ways to signal to students and their families that they could see themselves at that institution. It might be something like tapping disabled students who are enrolled in the institutions to kind of be ambassadors, to mentor incoming students when they arrive. There's certainly lots of benefits, research-based benefits to role modeling and mentorship, particularly with underrepresented, or make disabled people feel like they can be successful members of the community, but also feel like they can disclose their disability, that there wouldn't be repercussions from that, and that in fact they would be welcome to do so because disability is a valued aspect of diversity.
Thank you for that, Amanda. Emily, I'm going to ask you these next two questions because they relate back to a question that I asked you during our panel discussion. Don't you think it's better to inform authorities in advance about disability? This audience member thinks it'll be better to help support them in a better way. And a follow-up question by another audience member is, disclosure of disability should never be a reason to refuse admission. But don't you think that some rigorous courses may not be suitable for persons with disability? So isn't the college justified in asking students to disclose their disability? What are your thoughts on this?
So these are great questions, and I wish we had more time to explore them in more detail. As far as the requirement to, excuse me, disclose disability status, as Amanda has nodded to, there are pros and cons of that. Sometimes students may not realize the reasons that they might want to disclose, and so therefore they may miss out on some of the support services that may be available to them. They may not have the opportunity to really learn what their rights are if they're trying to kind of not associate with disability as they're exploring a new educational environment, kind of a new opportunity to explore who they are. And so again, making sure that we are offering opportunities for students to understand why that might be helpful for them to disclose that information or connect with resources, but not wanting to also be forcing them to disclose that they may not be at a point where they are interested in doing that. As far as the question about students with disabilities not being suitable for specific programming, that is not a decision that we should be making without individual conversations with the student. So rather than just assuming that a student who is blind is not going to be able to be successful in a specific program, we would want to have that conversation about any concerns or barriers with the student and with the necessary experts in that. So that's often the Disability Services Office, the student, and then maybe the faculty or staff in the program. Really learning about what are the concerns, what are the potential barriers, and then what are accommodations that might be able to be put in place to be able to work around that. And I'll give an example of a challenge that we worked with. Was we had a blind student who was in an art appreciation class. And so they were going to the museum, looking at pieces of art, and then having to, respond to that artwork in various different ways. And so, of course, the instructor was like, this student can't see the art. I don't think this is a good course for them. And rather than just assuming that, and in the United States, it would be illegal to tell a student that they couldn't take a course because of their disability, what we said was, well, what are you really trying to teach in this course? And how can we provide the student with verbal descriptions of what the artwork is? Are there opportunities for providing tactile versions of the art where they can gain that information in different ways? So rather than just jumping to conclusions or having those concerns and making decisions on our own, it needs to be a thoughtful process, an interactive process with the student. And it's also very important for programs to come up with the essential requirements of the program or the technical standards. What are the things that you absolutely have to be able to do in order to complete this course or this program? And one thing that we have noticed as far as medical education goes is that technology is changing a lot of that. And so before, a requirement for medical school would be you would have to hear a heartbeat. And so somebody who was deaf would then automatically be excluded if they weren't able to hear that. And recently that language is changing to you have to be able to detect a heartbeat, because there are different types of amplification, there's different types of technology that can now allow someone to detect a heartbeat aside from hearing it with your ears. And so that's an example of how we need to really be thoughtful and think critically about what are we trying to teach, what are students required to learn, and are there alternate ways of reaching that goal that may be different from the traditional ways that we expect students to do that. And so it is complicated, but it's also really important to give students the same opportunity to pursue their education and careers. And our role is really to support them in that process and figure out how can we support the student in reaching that goal. We cannot change the essential requirements of the course. So we're not going to tell a future or current medical student that, oh, well, finding a heartbeat isn't that important. That's pretty essential for a physician. But instead, we're figuring out how can we accomplish that goal? How can we work with you to figure out how we can support that? And so I hope some of these examples are helpful in sharing some of the complexity, but also the process that you can go through to engage with the student and the various experts to really make that determination and not just go off of assumptions based on the presence of disability.
Thank you, Emily. I think what comes to mind when you say that is, don't decide for me, engage with me. Ask me or engage with me. Manjushri, these next questions I think would be great for you. They are very relevant to our, to the current, to where we are in India. And there are two questions and I'm going to pose them both to you for want of time. The first is that many parents are not ready to accept that their children are special. How can one as an educator be of any aid in such a scenario? I think you're working with young kids as well as college age kids would really help. And the second I'm going to pose to you is, what do you think Indian students at college campuses can do to make their campus better, more accessible for students with disabilities, and bring the administration's attention to do something rather than just being set as a low priority? I know they are disjointed, but I think you could give me a very good answer for both these.
I'll answer your first question with regards to the parents. I think that's been a situation for time immemorial. And I'm not surprised, because if someone told you had cancer, it's not going to be taken very easily. So let's understand, get into their shoes, and acknowledge that it is initially not the most pleasurable thing to hear. How we deal with it is, one is there has to be a load of sensitivity when you are actually breaking the news, and which then means you really, when this has to be told to a parent, there is a right kind of language, there is a right kind of body language, and there is a right kind of tone of voice that needs, and even your gestures. Everything really matters when you are asking a parent to take the child for a testing experience and give them that roadmap and say, look, I need you to do this because I need to help your child. If the tone is set right, if I'm speaking with the parent from the perspective of being part of their team, that I'm not saying it to blame you or to probably make the child leave school or college, but I'm trying to say this because I truly, genuinely, and from the bottom of my heart, care for this learner in my school or college. And I want to do what is right for the learner. If I can use that tone, use that body language, and show my intent, if I can do that, then I can really reach to that parent, because the parent knows that I have the child's best interest in every word that I'm saying. Why does this fail many a times? Because somewhere parents get on the back foot. They think you're trying to blame them for that disability that the child has, or they can see it. It's a white elephant. It's like it's there in front of their eyes, but they're in denial because they don't want that to have happened to their child. Yeah, she's there. I saw Shreya's network broken. So that kind of, I hope that answers a parent question, because we need to contend with this a lot of the times. And I would also say bring in the experts. Many a times, this kind of acceptance doesn't come very easily from educators. We've seen, and I've been a special educator for 32 years now, and I've seen when this news is broken by a doctor to a child, they somehow take it up much faster. To a parent, they somehow seem to take it up. So be it. At the end of the day, why do we need to know that a child has a disability? So that we can start the journey of giving services to the learner. That's all there is to it. And if that is a message that is loud and clear to the parents, they will buy it and they will come around, and they will not be at, loggerheads with you. How dare you say that? Or what do you know? We live with our child for so many years. What do you know about our child? And all of that, which comes in initially because of denial. So that's a parent perspective. Your second question was about Indian colleges, and if I'm not mistaken, you were asking about how we can make it more disability friendly. Can you just remind me once again, Dheeraj?
Sure. The question was actually from one of our student audience members, that what do you think Indian students at campuses can do to make their campuses better and more accessible for students with disabilities?
Wow, what a lovely question. What a lovely question. Whoever has asked it has already taken the first step. Because if as a neurotypical or a person without a disability, I'm just going to make it as simple as that. If you're a person without a disability, just being aware, being mindful, being sensitive to the fact that there are those around us who have a disability, and being consciously inclusive. So one of the things I keep saying is that, many a times the disability enters before the person. That happens. So when there are visible disabilities like Emily was talking about. So taking cognizance and not really ignoring them, both are important. I mean, you don't want to give them too much attention, and you don't want to give a disabled person no attention at all. So being aware and having that midpoint where you are, it is what it is. Like I keep telling parents so many times that, you have diabetes. And that's it. I mean, where it's needed, you go out there, you tell the person, hey, don't put sugar in my tea because I have diabetes. And we're neither ashamed of it, we're neither proud of it. Similarly, if you are peers to a person with disabilities, all you need to do is treat them as one of your own, and not really look at the person as a person with a disability, or see the disability first. Because at the end of the day, it's the person inside that really matters. And they all have so much to share, so much to contribute, and enrich what you do on the campuses. So that's a beautiful question. I want to end with saying just one thing, that let's not assume anything about persons with disabilities. Emily has brought that up. Amanda has brought that up as well. We kind of assume that they may not be able to do this, or they may be able to do this. Just like any other individual on campus, let's just give them equal opportunities and options and choices, and then just see what they can come up with. The sky is really the limit.
Thank you, Manjushri. I know I've been very directional in our conversations, and I've been asking all the questions, and I've been asking all of you to just respond. And I also realize that we are over time, so I'm not going to try and take us much longer. But I would not be comfortable ending this without letting each of you just give us a minute of your thoughts on something that we've not discussed or not asked or not really considered. And the simple way to do this maybe is the way I introduced all three of you. So maybe Amanda, and then after you, Emily, and then finally Manjushri. Just a minute to let us know about something that we've not asked you.
Sure. Thank you for that opportunity. I would encourage us to really think about how it feels to be a member of this college or university community. And I think that really helps us look at the limitations sometimes of mere compliance and of individual accommodations. But how would it feel to not have the same level of choice, to feel disadvantaged in what you might be able to learn, to engage with as a student? And really start to ask ourselves then, not just what do I have to do, right, to comply with these laws? What do I have to do for the disabled students in my class? But what can I do to make my class, my experience more welcoming and inclusive? And I think one of the best ways to reflect on that is the lessons that we've learned in the last almost 2 years of a global pandemic, when we were all forced to challenge our assumptions about the classroom, the workplace, what participation looked like, we've all made accommodations in the last couple of years. And like Emily said, there's a lot that we can learn. I like to think about those silver linings, and in no way do I intend to undermine the significance of the pandemic, but the pandemic gave us all an opportunity, I think, to really think differently about the work we do, how we do the work we do, right? And I think maybe just to close, thinking about just that we get things done, not so much how we get things done. I think that's kind of a fundamental shift in our thinking about access and about how we might contribute to more equitable experiences moving forward.
Thank you, Amanda. Emily, any last thoughts?
So we've talked through so many things today. And one thing that I just want to add is disability community is so important and so powerful. And it's often something that people with disabilities don't get to experience. Because disability can be a very isolating experience. You may be the only disabled person in your family, in your community. And so coming together to a higher education institution may be the first opportunity that a disabled student has had to meet somebody else who has that shared life experience. And so we have just seen really some incredible stories through our student organization, our disabled student organization, of students finding those connections, finding that support, and all of a sudden disability goes from being something that seems very isolating to something that can be very empowering. And we've seen a lot of students have that shift in embracing their disability, embracing their identity, becoming part of the disability community. And so in addition to the aspects that we've talked about as far as increasing access and inclusion, I also would encourage folks to think about what does that look like as far as building community, providing events, providing space to bring disabled students together, allowing them to form those relationships, really normalize the experience of being disabled, and then inviting them in as partners in this journey for improvement and working towards a more accessible and inclusive campus. Students are learning so many things when they come to our campuses, and learning about their own identities and finding communities can be a really life-changing experience. So looking for opportunities to provide that and facilitate that for students can be really important.
Thank you so much, Emily. Manjushri, I'm going to give you the last word in the 1 minute before I close the session.
Yes, and since you've given me a minute, I'm going to summarize it with something that I've written some time back, and which eventually the theme of my end with a poem that I wrote a couple of years ago. And it kind of summarizes everything that Emily has said and everything that Amanda has put in, and it's a perfect tie-in, as well as it answers kind of the question that one of the students asked me about what can students do. So I'm going to end with saying, who is to say who is being included when all of us may have disabilities that are hooded? Why is inclusion something done by the haves to the have-nots? That sounds more like a favor of sorts. Nobody's special. We're all just unique. So inclusion is the acceptance of each one's individual streak. Why is it that we often say they are different from me, when actually what makes us so beautiful is our diversity? Let's redefine inclusion and shift the paradigm. No judgments, no labels, no biases. Well, it's about time. Let's talk less, be more. Let's include with our heart. Hug, hold hands, meet, greet, and smile. Even if there's COVID, that doesn't matter. Hug, hold hands, meet, greet, and smile. A great way to start. Let's get to know people beyond caste, gender, and disability. It's the person inside that matters. That's the real identity. And then someday, we'll need the word no more. And soon, we'll treat each other as one. And someday, we won't need to talk about inclusion anymore, because that day, our work will be done. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Manjushri. I think that was very well written. We've reached the end of this, the first of 3 panel discussions that we're going to have over the course of the next few months. And I hope that by the end of this short 90-minute discussion, that we've at least started thinking about what disability means for our campuses. How do we be more inclusive? How do we really deal with this more as I think what Emily said, that it's not what we have to do, but what we want to and we should be doing. Just to remind everyone that the Biden-Harris administration champions LGBTQ plus equality. And in continuation of this discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion, our next topic in the event that we're going to be hosting early February is on supporting LGBTQI plus communities at higher education institutions. So I really sincerely hope that we're able to start this conversation on disabled-friendly campuses, and I hope we can continue discussing with each of you as we move on to the next topic about LGBTQI plus communities. Have a great evening, and thank you all for staying with us today. I know we went beyond time, but I think this topic was so compelling that it was difficult to end it within the 90 minutes that we had scheduled. Thank you all for joining us, and hopefully see you again in February. Also, I would like to say thank you to my panelists who have given their time to us, to the Consul General David J. Rands, who came in and who gave us his time, his opening remarks, and encouraged this conversation, as well as the entire team that's helped us create this event from the Consulate, Beru Zavari and Simran Nagra, Prasanna, as well as from Notre Dame, Catherine Wilson, Yun Nam from the Consulate's Public Affairs section, who's been a support for us. We look forward to seeing all of you now in February for our next conversation. Thank you all for joining tonight.
Thank you.